Yeah? Okay. So we start, and whenever people come, they just come and sit. I think it's good. There's a lot of noise, that's why I don't really hear myself, but if everyone's hearing me, it's okay. So, welcome all, thanks for coming. I'd like to introduce you to Alice von Bieberstein. She's a social anthropologist living in Berlin and doing the research and fieldwork in Muş in eastern Anatolia about treasure hunters and their relation to the Armenians, basically the Armenian history of the place and the Armenian situation that we are living now. And as maybe you have visited already, or you just arrived, the ceiling that I've made this year for the Bienali is a ceiling that shows card signs that I found on web forums, where a lot of treasure hunters looking for treasure were sharing the pictures of from all over Anatolia, the signs they found on stones as they were looking for it and asking the meaning of these signs to one another and trying to grasp a meaning of the sign and also where the sign can lead them. And then I was curious about how this affected, the whole unwritten narrative and history of our past that was shaped with the Republic, and that how the Greeks, Armenians, and all sorts of people had to move from their houses and leave their belongings and homes behind for the hope that they would come back sometime and dig their treasure. But some of them are still coming in looking for their belongings and lost ones, and some of them has already gone. So within this scope, I wanted to open the ideas around the work to a series of conversation and a public program called The Lost Treasure. And starting with Alice today, we will have two more speakers on 19th and the 19th of September and 1st of October in Jazair to discuss these ideas around this work that relate us to back to our history. And the other speakers will be Zeynep Oğuz from Hrant Dink Foundation, and they are running an inventory of the non-Muslim wealth and all over Turkey. So they will present their project. And also Neşe Özgen, who's a sociologist studying the borders, will give a talk about how human body is used as a treasure in these borders of Turkey. So that's the other program. But coming back to today's program, Alice came from Berlin yesterday to thank you, Alice. And she has she's a great writer. She's written a lot of articles about this issue. And I've read a couple of her articles and ideas, and I was so surprised that somebody was working on this field that I was kind of trying to grasp, and we coincidentally met on Facebook again when I was talking about what I've been doing in the process of this production, and I was sharing my production process, and then there's a friend of ours who introduced us, and then we find out that we're kind of thinking similarly towards this subject. So I would like to, this is a talk of Alice, so I would like to give the microphone to Alice. It's going to be like a half an hour talk developing ideas around the subject, and if you may stay until the end, then we're opening it to the questions. Thank you.
Hello everybody, welcome. Hoş geldiniz. Yes, I would like to thank Deniz for the invitation and İKSV for making it possible for me to come here. See it not only on the photographs, but for real. And I first wanted to draw your attention to the building itself, which was introduced to me as an abandoned Greek house. And you can come through, and maybe we can keep the corridor a bit free so that people can still come and go. That would be really good, not to make it a closed space. And because I think it's very important to think about where this piece is actually being exhibited. And so it was introduced to me as an abandoned Greek house, and when we kind of talked about it with Deniz, it turned out that it now belongs to a rich Turkish family, and so the original owners are kind of unknown or have been made unknown. I mean, we always have to, introduce these very active verbs, not to make it seem like something natural is happening here, but this is an action. I mean, these are the active processes of expropriation and dispossession that we have to think as the conditional possibility itself for making possible for us to be here today. Okay, because of course it is this rich Turkish family that actually gave the permission to install this piece, and not the original owners, the former Greek family, who might have said, fuck off. Who knows, I mean, we don't know, but I think it's something that we have to kind of keep in mind. So, so it's important to think about all of these dynamics of hiding and revelation, and kind of corresponding concerns with truth and secrecy, and this idea of something coming to light, which is both a societal process in a way that is driving a lot of people, including Deniz's work, but a lot of people in Turkey in the last sort of 10, 20 years. And so this kind of dynamic of truth and secrecy and kind of hiding and revelation is at play, of course, in a kind of doubled way almost. I mean, both in the work itself and how it's come about, as well as in the theme, So, because of course this kind of concern and the curiosity and the will to know that is made possible through a kind of liberalization of the public sphere, at least a differential. Of course, it's always, other chapters remain closed, but at least over the last 10, 20 years, certain realms of knowledge, certain stories have become accessible that have formerly were off limits or were hard to access. And a lot of people are in a process of kind of curiosity and engaging with these kind of knowledges and stories. And these are driving such works, for instance. But of course, it is also something that is inherent in the practice of treasure hunting itself, which is an obsession and a kind of pleasure of digging and rendering visible what is inherently and by definition invisible. And I was thinking that in general, I like, there's a lot of inversions happening here that Deniz is kind of bringing up through her work, which is, of course, on the one hand, there's an inversion from top to bottom, because now we're looking up as to what is essentially a phenomenon that has a lot to do with the underground and with what is invisible. So there's an inversion of our perspective. There's also an inversion in terms of the outside and inside space, because normally this is a practice that happens outside, and people go and roam the countryside and look around everywhere for these kind of patterns and motifs and symbols. And so Deniz is bringing them back home in a very uncanny way, because of course there are the traces of violence. They are rendered target. They are the process by which certain objects are rendered targets of violence, because these symbols are usually never there to stay for long, and they're only identified in order to be destroyed. Because usually people see them, find them, try to find out what they mean in order to remove them or destroy them. So this is in a way bringing that process home and making it in a very uncanny way. Of course, there's also the issue of normally these symbols, you would find them on rocks and on stones. Now they're on wood, which has been very cleaned as a surface in a way. It's a very smooth surface, what is normally a very rocky kind of surface. So there's a lot of kind of inversions which mirror this kind of dynamic of hiding and revealing and these kind of things, which I think is fruit and food for thought. Now, as Deniz introduced, I've been doing field work in a region that can be referred to as Eastern Anatolia, can also be referred to as Northern Kurdistan or Western Armenia. It is known by many names, which is part of the story. My background is I've worked sort of on the Armenian community in Germany and in Turkey. So when I first came to Mush, that was part of my background and kind of part of what I listened into, and it soon became clear to me that the most frequent reference to the term Armeni is indeed in relation to gold, altın, or treasure, define, hazine, and this is how this term circulates the most. Besides reference to the descendants of survivors who survived by converting to Islam, so these are the Islamicized Armenians or the descendants of Islamicized Armenians, and that is also a very frequent reference. So within the kind of general population, people refer to, that he's actually Armenian. This is a kind of by blood logic, not by much else, but still. So it drew my attention because it's a very frequent kind of topic of conversation and stories, and because it's entertaining, it has a lot to do with kind of sort of pleasure of adventure and kind of exploring and bonding between boys, going out to go hunting, so to speak. I mean, not animals, but like these kind of signs and stuff like this. So there's a lot of evening talk, stories, people sharing pictures on their phones of these signs that they found. There's always, I've been shown these plenty of times by, because I'm supposedly kind of coming from the West, which means I'm European, which means I'm Christian, which means I'm almost Armenian, which means I should have access to this kind of knowledge. And I'm of course I'm a hoja, I'm a kind of, learned person. I go at university, so there's all these kind of expectations that I hold knowledge about the meaning of these very various and random symbols. So that's also how I was drawn into the whole thing. And of course, also in the area, when you go there and you say, araştırma yapıyorum, and then you're researching, so ne araştırıyorsun? Altın araştırıyorsun. And so, are you looking for gold? Is always one of the assumptions. If I'm not an agent for the European Union or the German state or whatever, then I am necessarily after gold, because who on earth would go to Mush? I mean, really, who on earth? And even with my old friends here in Istanbul, like my kind of, who've known me for 10, 15 years, their families, or like old Kemalist families, they find it very, very dodgy that I go to Mush, so it's, anyway, but, so, this practice of treasure hunting is kind of is a very widespread phenomenon, and it's really kind of done by almost, I don't know any family that does not have a cousin or a brother or an uncle or a father or a relative who is into this treasure hunting business, which has a lot to do, of course, with the fact that Mush is one of the poorest areas of Turkey. I think in terms of the development index, it's kind of at the bottom of many, many indicators. So there's widespread unemployment, it's kind of structurally impoverished. It's also actively impoverished by the central state because it's part of Kurdistan, and so of course there's a very high youth unemployment, and even though it's kind of across the board, and you cannot say that the upper class or the rich people don't do it, and the more the popular, everybody does it. But of course it kind of drives the poorer more than the richer, and because especially young people who are unemployed, young men who are unemployed and have a lot of time at their hands, who have pressures to kind of build a family or make money to kind of have the right consumer items, and so it drives this kind of and so a lot of times people are introduced or kind of come into the thing through boredom, and they just have nothing much better to do. And then it lures, of course, it seduces with the pleasure of kind of adventure and going out together, all together. You can acquire this knowledge. It's kind of, you can share, you can speculate, so it's a lot of fun, in a way. Officially, legally, of course, it is forbidden, and there's a lot of ways in which there's ways of kind of trying to avoid the radar of the state. Okay, I'm trying not to take this personal.
There's a lot of going on.
I know. I know, it's fine. So yes, officially it's forbidden, but that doesn't mean very much in Turkey, as we know, because it's kind of tacitly tolerated, and there's of course ways actually in which this is actively promoted. So although there's all these kind of, you can get a permit, you can apply officially at the governor's office to apply for a permit to dig. Nobody of course does that because it's also very easy. Eventually you can get a reward if you actually inform. I mean, if you go out without a permit, let's say you're 4 people, you go, you dig, you find something, and then one of them, there's of course an issue of mistrust, it's very difficult, so in the end somebody goes to the state and says, or to the police and says, well, and then they get a share. So actually the state kind of actively promotes this kind of mistrust and the kind of, to get in, because they then get the largest share, and on top of it they have a system of informants, which is also a very big part of history in this country. So the practice still is very much about escaping the vision of the state and actually trying to do it sort of in secret. Now, as I said, it is quite striking the way that these objects are referred to as Armeni. This is usually the shorthand for, as I said, for gold or treasures. And in a way it speaks of an implicit kind of recognition, of course, of the history of the area and of who lived there before, and whose descendants, as I said, some of these Islamized Armenians and the descendants still live there. And this kind of implicit acknowledgement of the history, of course, has a lot to do with the fact that simply there is a local kind of knowledge that is there because people just know. This is not like in the west of the country where, Armenians might have come to Turkey after the fall of the Soviet Union. There's all these kind of weird understandings that, Armenians never lived in these lands, that is more prevalent on this side of the country, which you do not. In Kurdistan or in the east, it's kind of very clear, there's a very kind of rooted local knowledge of that history. And of course, in the recent years, it has also become part of the Kurdish movement's political program that sets them apart from other political forces in the country, this kind of active recognition. But in a way it also speaks, because in a strange way it also speaks of the very precarious position of the Kurds within the kind of political setup, because it is usually accompanied by a kind of almost internalized colonial look, because there is still a kind of bourgeois aesthetic that often goes into talking about people who are treasure hunters, especially by those who don't, and who would set themselves apart. And then there's this kind of like, Kurds who are not good for anything else, they're just so stupid, and this is, they have no evaluation for material heritage, and so there's this kind of internalized colonial gaze, that speaks through a lot of the discourse on treasure hunting. Both here, but also in Mush itself. And but what is interesting nonetheless is that even though these objects and the kind of things are always referred to as Armeni, the thing itself, and even though it is somewhat embedded in this discourse of also of a lost modernity, there's all this talk of like, when the Armenians lived in this land, there was like the slopes around Mush were filled with vineyards, and we had all these wine factories, and the wine was exported to Marseille, and we had these clay pipes, and they came down from the mountains, and people were sending like milk. They milk the cows up on the mountains, and the milk would like flow through these clay pipes. And there's all this like really insane talk of the ingenuity and the craftsmanship and the artisanry and the kind of of the Armenians, again, as opposed to us stupid Kurds who don't know how to do anything, So that's kind of part of the talk. And so in a way, though, this history becomes very unspecified and unspecified in its actual kind of presence, and it's almost a mythical time. And the way people move around the landscape, or how I've experienced it and how I've moved around the landscape with people, is that it's really cut. There's space here, you can sit down. It's really cut off from an actual engagement. Like it's a very cut off history in a way. It's like it's a very mythical time, and it's unspecified, and it's really kind of a signifier of a very generic pastness. You know, it becomes a signifier of the original, of the authentic, and which will slowly bring us back to this kind of fascination with symbols. You know, because it becomes these objects are kind of almost auraticized. I mean, they're invested and charged with a particular aura. You know, that of something that is then cherished and held and kind of cared for and handled with great care and wonder, because these things come out of the ground and they're like treated, you know, that they come from an era before, of course, mechanical reproduction. You know, there's the ideas of craftsmanship and artisanry attached to them, which is something that is very distinct from consumption patterns now that we are surrounded by in the present. So it's fascinating the way people give these objects a very special place in their household. They might be wrapped up in kind of, I mean, if something is found, you know, they might be wrapped up in kind of special pieces of cloth, held in a special corner, you know, taken out to kind of be looked at. And like, there's a lot of kind of curiosity and a kind of hermeneutic, I mean, kind of a reading of what this object might tell me, okay? So there's an incredible attention given what the different parts, what the shape, what the kind of ciphers and the kind of reading and the symbols, what it might mean, you know? So, you know, like might be a little statue of Mary that has been found in a field. It's made out of bronze or whatever, and then, you know, it's like handled around. People put it in their mouth to taste the metal. It's like people try to imitate the posture to see, well, what is she holding in her hand? What does it mean? You know, there's something has faded here. What could have been the inscription there? I mean, there's an incredible kind of investment in the object itself and in what the message that they might hold. And so it's really a lot of things have been written in a way about how things come to life and how things, and I think it's a very fertile kind of field to think about how objects, how we can think about objects in the ways that exceed their kind of representational quality, because this is not just about what it means, you know? These are objects that come alive. I mean, they hold riddles of, you know, of mystery. They need to be deciphered. They need to be decoded. So these are objects that are very much alive in a way. And of course, there's a lot of writings or a lot of things that people have written and thought about how processes of destruction, in particular, how when objects that might be considered sacred or hold particular power, how particular objects actually attract this kind of attention, and also an attention of desecration and attention of ruination. So how some objects, you know, it kind of, people want to go at it. Like, you know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, people go and kind of want to destroy or rip down particular monuments and stuff like this. So there is of course objects that attract this particular kind of, you know, you want to unleash violence onto them, or you want to care for them in a certain way. So it's kind of interesting to think about not just like what they mean and how they might be embedded in a history of kind of representation or references to an Armenian history, but it's really interesting to think about how people handle and care for them, and this kind of aliveness of these objects and how we can think about them. So, so of course, if we look at the ceiling, and we think about where Denis found these symbols and these forums and the kind of obsession and the kind of, you know, desire and the kind of time people spend sharing and exchanging, you know, it's of course points us in the direction of the fetish, I mean, and of the idea of the fetish. And it's kind of interesting. There's an anthropologist at Columbia University called Michael Tausig. He's quite kind of a pop, I mean, he's a bit of a pop figure. He always has, like, you know, 3 buttons open and his chest hair out, and he's quite a performer, but he's done really incredible work anyway. But he's worked a lot on acts of defacement and kind of how these objects become alive and these kind of processes. And so he has these really nice ways, for instance, of defining and of describing. I have to find the structure of fetishes, which I think can help us a lot to think about what is going on here. And I just have to find to see the, yeah. So for him, and I just want to quote because I like these quotes of his. So the structure of he defines as fetish as that which absorbs into itself that which it represents, but erasing in the process all traces of the represented. And I find it's very interesting and kind of helpful to think about how these objects in a way feed off the violence of this history of the Armenian genocide, of the violent displacement and dispossession of the Armenian population, but at the same time manage to kind of become tethered or become removed and detached from that very history through this process of fetishization, you know? Because in the end what we have are objects that are revered and kind of valued, and of course are their ultimate destination, so to speak, is to enter a market of antiques and a market of that kind of valuation where they can be made to be turned into cash or into value, you know, and people always hope to get rich and finally find redemption in that kind of wealth, and they can finally leave Mush and move to Izmir and start another kind of life, right? So this is the hope. So, but it's quite interesting the way exactly how, you know, when you think about this kind of definition of the fetish, how it depends. I mean, Michael Tausig also talks about how these objects very often have to do with what he calls the public secret, and the public secret is the most important of social knowledges, which is the knowledge which is to know what not to know. Okay, so. It's very important, you know, and it will ring a bell to people who have grown up in this country, of course, yeah. So his idea is that basically these kind of is that kind of knowledge and the kind of a kind of necromantic power, a power of death that always feeds the force of the state. It feeds the kind of strength of the state, and it feeds the kind of spectral life and quality and strength and force that a state has because most nation states nowadays are founded on some kind of original act of violence, and the same applies to Germany, and the same applies to Turkey. Yeah. So when you, what do I want to say? But yeah, so exactly. So this idea that basically fetishes, in a way, that these objects attract and absorb, and they are charged with the power that they have, and the kind of force of attraction that they have, because they're embedded in a history of violence and a history of a murder, of violence, and of dispossession. And of course, this is something that's been going on because it's not just the original murder of the Armenian population of the region, and the following and the consecutive kind of dispossession, but it's a history, of course, that unfolded and continued throughout the 20th century in the kind of monasteries, like the kind of remains, the material remains of the Armenian population was turned into military training grounds. Graveyards were dismantled and turned, used to build schools. So there's a long history of kind of dismantling these material structures that were left by those who were killed, and using them to, turn them into all sorts of other kind of spaces. And actually, the more that was destroyed, the more and the less there is, the more it seems it kind of feeds into this obsession with these kind of objects. And it's really quite amazing because there's a lot of church ruins of which there's pretty much nothing left, and still people dig like crazy. I mean, there's no bound to it and there's no end to it, it feeds, it's really an imagination overdrive, and it feeds very much exactly on these kind of symbols, and the fewer they are, the more charged they almost become, and the more kind of powerful of an attraction, like attractive force, they kind of exert. Yeah, so there's a kind of obsession with kind of symbolism per se, and whatever is shaped whatever has a shape, can become an object. I mean, can become the target of this kind of curiosity and of this kind of, and that's what I talked about at the beginning, of this kind of violence. So in the end, it's kind of interesting the way that it actually often has little to do with whether these objects have anything to do actually with an Armenian history of the area, because it's so much about the kind of desires and the little kind of investment that is, that these objects are charged with, because, people, I've seen, little polyester statues that, I mean, I have no idea where they come from, but just because they were found, they came from underground, or people found them digging somewhere, they get their special place in the corner. Or, there's like, people found metal bowls, and then you're like, oh, can I have a look? And it's like made in China on the back, but then these objects are still, like, they hold a very special value in a very special place, and are given these very kind of special corners in people's homes, and shown around, and still, made of these objects of contemplation and speculation, and kind of, become an object around which people can have a conversation. So in a way, it's another way to think about it is, I try to make sense of it is exactly through this kind of detachment. What I was always very struck with is exactly how, on the one hand, there's a kind of archaeological passion and an archaeological curiosity, because these objects must be constituted as coming from the past and having this kind of status of an original. But at the same time, there's always the kind of engagement with them, and the reading with them is always future-oriented. It's always about, where can it lead me? Like, okay, this is, what message might it hold that might help me find the next step, like in the puzzle, that maybe down the road, like if I go 10 meters further, it points to me that 10 meters further I will be lucky to find something else, or it can give me an indication of, how much value it has and where I can find cash. And people say that, that it's really it's a very optimistic, an extremely optimistic practice in a way, because it knows no end point and no point of failure. I mean, there's no point at which you can say, okay, that's it. Because people start digging and say, well, actually, maybe 5 meters further, further to the right, or further to the west, or further like to the, it's like, and it's really crazy. There's no point, and people in the process hurt their backs, they fall into, the pits, they kind of course, because it's a very expensive practice, you need to kind of get the gear, you need to rent cars, you need to find maybe metal detectors, which are very expensive, you might want to get hold of a map. I mean, there's a lot of resources that go into actually starting out and doing this kind of going on these kind of adventures and endeavors. So people end up being really impoverished, and you actually pay a really high price for it. But there's this is also the overdrive, it's really, there's no end to it, and which is of course in the nature of gold. I mean, and the kind of the desire it triggers is always boundless in a way, So in a way, it's interesting, because as these objects kind of appear from the ground, or they appear out of nowhere, there's no recognized human body. I mean, there's no person who actually gives these objects, right? They kind of appear out of nowhere, and they appear as if they come out of the future. I mean, they come out of, somebody has left them, but it's really up to the person who finds these objects or engages with them to, in a way, constitute them as this kind of pure gift that comes out of nowhere, or is it part of a transaction over time, if you see what I mean? Because it's quite, the way you handle and engage with them, it's kind of up to you to say, oh well, do I only engage with the message itself, or do I engage with the person who left the message? Am I open to actually think about who made this, and through whose hands it kind of passed, or am I only interested in the object and in where it might lead me further? So in that sense, it's it's somewhere we can think about the kind of, if there is a space for the ethical response, so to speak, and for the ethical relation to the original makers and the original owners, and this kind of, if it's something that appears from the past and was given to you and is a gift from somebody in a way because it comes out of the ground, or if I deny that kind of relationality and I constitute it as this pure object that kind of comes out of nowhere and I can just take it and kind of handle it and pass it on. And so in general, I mean, my experience is that exactly this kind of, because this Armenian history is kind of mythicized and kind of, held in this generic pastness modus, it assists in kind of denying the relationality that goes into relating to these objects as part of a network of relations, that kind of made this bring about and kind of can make me think about how I stand in relation to other people who are no longer there by means of these objects, okay? But I mean, the way that I think about it is, so on the one hand, this relationality is very much denied, precisely through this fetishization, through this process of fetishization, and through this process of cutting, and this process of denial that kind of reappears despite the implicit recognition of it being Armeni. There's still a kind of investment of denial taking place. But in a way, there's theories of the gift and kind of commodity exchange, and this idea of the gift, and how a gift always incurs a debt, right? So if you get something, it's never the pure gift. In a way, you always owe something to the person that's given to you, And in a way, that this denial, the denial of the relationality and the denial and the disavowal and the rejection of the debt or of the ethical response to the person that gives it, in many ways actually comes back as a curse. And the curse, or the kind of curse, comes in the form of this extreme poverty that hits most of definitives. I mean, most of these treasure hunters search a lifetime for things and spend thousands and thousands of liras and euros without ever finding anything. And the second thing is, of course, that these objects are extremely, in a way, elusive and evasive, because mostly they appear only to disappear, because either somebody is an informant, informs the state comes and takes it all, or it's stolen by the uncle, because the uncle says, okay, we dug it together, but whatever, I have the male authority, it's patriarchy, so the cousin, whatever, found it with the cousin together, but the cousin has no say, because if the uncle takes it by himself, nothing that you can do, On the other thing is, there's all these kind of stories of, spells. This is another chapter, but so this idea is that Armenians, before they left, cast spells on these objects. And that you have to have the right spell break, because if you don't have the right spell break, the treasure turns into butterflies or dust if you lift it. So you need to have Armenians still with you, actually, because they are the only ones who have access to this kind of knowledge and this kind of magical knowledge. And there's, so there's still, even though, so there's kind of these treasures are always haunted, because there's also stories of people dig the foundation of their house, they start thinking something is under my house, they start digging the house and the house collapses over them. Or there are stories of people finding stuff and somebody actually becomes rich, but 2 years later they suddenly die. It's always the whole discourse and the whole kind of stories and all of the phenomena is completely, it's completely embedded in this kind of, that it's actually futile in a way. It's kind of always haunted by the fact that it disappears, and you cannot hold on to it. In whichever way, whether it's the state, whether it's the Armenian butterflies, or it's the kind of, there's multiple ways in which it can kind of disappear. But, so that's kind of my end of the story.
Also there, no, it's and on plus, it's like a lot of people go to treasure hunting together, and when they find it, just like the rest is killing, because just only one wants to have it all, and then the rest of it is killed. So I've been listening to all these stories since many years, because I was curious with this phenomena and also this myths around it, the spells, the people going, digging, investing, looking, and it's always like this kind of haunted memory, I think. And so that was very fascinating me, and I think your research and the way you speak about it is really bringing a lot of questions, not only one, but a lot of questions in many levels. One of my questions is that is about the urban transformation that's happening in Mush, and then you probably, like I read it in the news, that a lot of the houses were looted before it was open to the municipality to destroy these apartments. So would you tell us if you had any experiences with that while you were there, about and how you think of this in terms of how the state still ruins, and in a micro level the people are ruining. It is like, you know, raping the dead, you know, like the second time, the third time, while you're still dealing with these people's lost identities, lost homes, you know.
Yeah, I was the one to tell the media about it. That's why you heard of it. No, but I was there when that happened, and yeah, so I called Agos, and then they picked it up and whatever. No, but yeah, so the around the time of Gezi in 2013, I was actually here, and then I returned to Muş, and it was a process. Because there is the kentsel dönüşüm, the kind of urban regeneration projects that are of course taking place all throughout the country, and most attention is being given to these kind of larger projects here in Istanbul, but these are processes that are happening throughout the country, and also in places that have received less attention. And basically this was a deal between the municipality and TOKİ, the kind of social housing whatever, how do you call it? Company, yeah. And they struck a deal that they would target the old historical quarter of Muş, which is the old Armenian Quarter as well. And so the idea was to kind of destroy the remaining old buildings of the place. And it's on top of, you have to imagine Muş is on a slope, okay? It's really, Muş is, it's a big valley. And the city itself is kind of settled on this kind of slope. And the old quarter of the town, the old historical quarter, is at the very, very top. And then basically that was abandoned in kind of Republican time, and the kind of urban structure sort of developed by rippling down the hill, basically. So on top is where the poorest of the poorest remained, because these are houses that have, you know, no canalization, no central heating, of course. And, you know, waves of kind of villages, you know, lastly also in the 90s when villages were burned, blah, blah, blah, they kind of came to settle there. And so these are the poorest of the poorest, and of course they're always easiest to target. And yeah, so they declared this a kind of kentsel dönüşüm, like an urban regeneration area, and as in other places in a similar kind of process and dynamic, they were given contracts. I mean, they had no choice but to sign, sell their houses, and in return for the promise of then eventually inhabiting an apartment in these kind of TOKİ buildings. But of course, because the state says, well, these TOKİ apartments, they're worth more, they're more valuable than these old historical buildings in which you've lived, besides giving us your land and us giving you a flat, you have to pay 30,000 or 45,000 or 20,000 lira on top of it, which of course is more than most of these families are going to earn for their entire life. So, but there's no other way than to kind of sign the contracts. I mean, there's no legal way to appeal. And so this is kind of course, if you think against the background of the expropriation of Armenians and the displacement and the kind of expelling of the Armenian population of the quarter, which happened a century ago, more or less precisely a century ago. It was actually in the first or second week of August. Or July? No, July. Was it July or August? But it was in the summer, so it was 100 years ago. That they bombed the quarter, and then they set the houses on fire, and they killed everybody on the spot. Yeah. Now the modality 100 years later is to kind of take the road of debts and indebt people and kind of disown them and expropriate them through these kind of means and displace them. In the process, then when I returned from Gezi, people were then in the process of kind of, they'd been given a notice to leave their house, and they were leaving their houses. And of course it was a very stark kind of contrast between what was going on here and then going in Muş, and the kind of, a bit of complacency, or kind of, there was no mobilization, no kind of mass mobilization against what was happening. But people left the houses, and they were selling beams, you know, the wooden beams, wooden ceiling. They were selling the wooden beams and metal frames of their house to kind of, at least, I mean, they were dismantling their own former homes in order to turn whatever was of value into some kind of cash that they could then take on. And when that was completed, there was the craze set on, because at least before people were living there, so they might have dug in a corner of their house, but they wouldn't go all the way. But now, because there was nothing left, the whole thing was kind of dismantled, and people just went for the whole thing and kind of turned the whole area kind of inside out. And people came with a kepche, you know, what are they called in English? The baga, the kepche, I don't know what it is in English, I always forget. It's kind of these huge machines, you know, that kind of can lift the ground and remove the rubble and... Huh? A bulldozer. Yeah, no, not a bulldozer. Excavator. Thank you. Yes, an excavator. So they went in with excavators because there's all these rumors that there was an Armenian bank and all these kind of stories. So they turned the whole thing kind of upside down. Except for one man, which was very interesting. His name is Ercan, and he's a good friend of mine now. And he did a very interesting thing, and I think it's very interesting because it shows a kind of shift of discourse, or a shift because he said, okay, we don't have a state of law here anyway, you know, we don't have a Rechtsstaat, we don't have a kind of, you know, there's no legal security anyway, so I'm not going to open a court case against the expropriation of my home. This is not going to get me anywhere anyway, because this is Erdogan's state, he can do whatever he wants to do, I have no power against him, this is not the way to go. But what he did instead, so he didn't say, okay, this is illegal, you know, this expropriation, because it's my property, this expropriation is illegal. What he did instead is to say, I am going to basically mobilize the discourse of material heritage. So I got him into contact with Agos, so there was this always, you know, there was a bit of kind of public attention around the destruction of the old town and about his house and his struggle. And then he went to Van, to the, the Koruma Kurumu, is the, you know, Kültür Koruma Kurumu. So the kind of the regional authority that takes care of heritage, okay? And he managed to get these people, like these kind of bureaucrats and technocrats, to assess his house and declare it a kind of material heritage. And so this was the way he could protect his house, you know? But it's very interesting because this is a discourse that is so not in place in many ways, you know? I mean, it's just now like, you know, I'm of course along the Aegean coast and the kind of, you know, the Greek kind of ruins, okay, but like in Mush, you know, after 30 years of civil war, like now you have these kind of initiatives, and you have these, of course there's the restoration initiatives, but the fact that he was able to kind of mobilize this discourse and these kind of authorities in order to protect his house, I found very interesting, you know, that this was the way to go. It points, I mean, I think this is kind of shows how the area is opening up to tourism, of course, in many ways, and, you know, to other kind of modalities of money making and all of these things. But yeah, of course, it's, yeah, sorry.
Of course. I would like to ask if you have any questions, or I can go further, but I would just like, if anyone's dying to ask a question, because I think it's an interesting subject, and I mean, if there is no question, I can ask one more. Yeah?
When I first saw the work, it's very powerful in the sense that there's all these little stories that are very evasive and you know, fleeting, and you kind of want to catch on to them and you can't. And you just told us of the ways in which these treasure hunters are kind of like appropriating and then kind of like doing away with this story. And it's very heartbreaking that way. And I'm still, as you were talking, I found myself wanting to find some kind of a connection to the storytellers themselves, you know, and this is a story you're actually telling us, you know, that how these stories have been broken, and you know, that's the idea. That's the idea of the life we live today. So what I'm wondering is, two things you mentioned. You said there were spells on these objects left from the Armenians, and only if there was an Armenian left, going around with these people, could they break the spell. Have you ever spoken to those Armenians? Any Armenians who are actually like looking for objects with the other people, with the treasure hunters, and or any other people who are actually like going back, not looking for treasures, but kind of like trying to find the sign they left behind, the story they wanted to tell. Is there another way into the story, the actual story?
I've been with, I've accompanied groups of Armenians who go, but they usually don't come on their own. So the moments I was able to hook onto these kind of visitors and these kind of journeys was usually when they're organized as a tour, and these are then heritage tours that are organized either from Istanbul or from Armenia or from the diaspora. So, and these are then kind of pilgrimage tours more, and of course this is another modality of engaging with the land, and so these are kind of tours that then people are descendants, sometimes old, so there might be the direct descendants of survivors, or the grandchildren who heard a lot of stories of the origin of the village of their grandparents and who want to come and see it, and sometimes have very detailed knowledge of the topography or of the kind of setup. And so there's a very intimate engagement with the land and with the kind of soil and with the kind of, with the objects, but not, so this is kind of one level that where that kind of happens and that occurs. But there is still, because of the legacies of fears, and because these journeys are quite quick often, people don't stay very long and they just go to the village of their grandparents, move on to the next, they make a tour and then they basically move on. There's no real kind of building up of relationships of sorts where another kind of engagement could unfold or build up or develop. That's one thing. Otherwise, I heard of stories. I have not met an Armenian who's gone on a kind of treasure hunting trip together, but I've heard. You hear, especially in the 80s and 90s, people tell of past days where individual Armenians might have come to look for the buried treasures of their grandparents, and some people have ended up being killed. So this kind of the death of the donor, killing the giver of the gift in order to render it as this kind of thing is not something that is just kind of metaphorical. It actually happens, okay, or people tell me of it happening. I was told one story of two Armenians coming from Istanbul through a contact in Mardin of an Islamicized Assyrian. Anyway, this is a kind of complicated story, and they took them on a trip because they had found this stone that had the shape of a snake, and they wanted to dig there, and they were digging fine, and then this Armenian from Istanbul was holding some kind of rosary in his hand or something in his hand, and he was murmuring kind of, but inaudibly, not loud. And so the guy was telling me the story, said he was doing this, and suddenly we were digging really smoothly, and suddenly we got to the point where it stopped, we couldn't dig any further. And then, he's like, this is really strange, and he said, you have to be there to see it and believe it, that these things are happening, So that is kind of where the Armenian reappears as actually having a kind of agency and power over the process itself. And so basically they didn't trust, he said that, they didn't trust somebody, they didn't feel comfortable, so through this kind of spell or through this kind of magic, they managed to just kind of stop the digging. Then there's, of course, Armenians are not just people who come from abroad, the Armenians are also there. So, in the sense of these descendants of the survivors, and there's a tricky kind of, let's say, performance or performance of identity that takes place with these, because vis-a-vis me, they approach me often with a very openness and a kind of that I'm kind of potentially one of them, or that they can trust because I'm not Muslim, I'm not Turkish, I'm not Kurdish, I'm not all of these things. I'm not a treasure. Well, yeah, that's not so important. It's more that I'm not part of the body, or the kind of the body of repression, okay? Or I'm not kind of that. So I'm potentially an ally, or potentially somebody that one can confide in or can build trust with, or I'm part of this Christian whatever. But so when I talk to them about this, it's like, oh yeah, it's so terrible, you know, all these treasure hunters, and you know the way they destroy, and no respect for history, and no respect for, and this is our stuff, blah blah blah blah blah. But you know, then around the corner you hear that they're very much into this. So it's not, you know, there's also a kind of course, because a lot of these Müslümanlaştırılmış Ermeniler, or this kind of, these Armenians are very much in the process of rediscovering and redefining themselves and remaking themselves as, because now there's a space opened up for expressing themselves qua as Armenian, okay? So this is no longer impossible. So there's a lot of experimenting with what that can mean, you know, how I can be Armenian in Mush, like what does it mean? And of course being with me is a moment to kind of perform that and kind of play with that. And part of that is of course to say, okay, we are of course the official and rightful inheritors of these kind of objects, and we would never desecrate a cemetery or a church in order to look for them. But then, you know, around the corner I hear other stories of actually them being very much involved, and there's like rumors of them being fake Armenians, of people taking on Armenian identity, of traveling to Armenia, of taking on Armenian name, of learning Armenian in order to access this kind of knowledge, okay? So it becomes very slippery. I mean, actually where one identity or where one kind of category, you know, begins and ends is not always so clear, you know? I mean, in the same way that, you know, these objects can be indeed made of bronze and can be valuable, but can also be out of polyester and made in China, you know? So there's a kind of, this kind of original and fake, and this kind of like who is, you know, it's I mean, 100 years down the line, it's very hard to draw these very clear boundaries of who is who, you know, and who is, you know, who is the rightful owner and the rightful inheritor and the rightful kind of can make these claims. So it's a very complicated picture in that way. But I have not, and I would like to, I mean, because there's talk, you know, that because of course for most of the Armenian community here and people that I know and I'm in contact with or friends with, you know, this is a very, or people who come also to visit Mush and who see the violence and who see the I mean, and it's really sad. I mean, if you have any kind of history of engaging and kind of spending time or kind of trying to approach this pain of the genocide and of that, like if you stand in these majestic, I mean, there are these majestic places, these monasteries, you know, where one wall is still standing. I mean, it's really overwhelming, and I find myself crying. I mean, I'm not a very sentimental and nostalgic or whatever type of person, but it's just so overwhelming, you know? So I can understand, I mean, this is, of course, and it's like, these are graves, you know, I mean, there are people who dig graves. I mean, people who actually dig graves because they think, oh, well, people were buried with, you know, bracelets and rings and stuff like this. This is hard stuff, you know? So, of course, for a lot of people and Armenians who come, it's very kind of painful and very, you know, obviously, I mean, it's a huge, it's really the second death, you know, it's really the second killing in a very big way. But then you also hear, okay, but there's also Armenians who are like in, you know, Kapalı or who are, you know, businessmen who might be the intermediaries of actually dealing with these kind of objects and might sell them, blah, blah, blah, blah, blah. So it's always, there's never an ethical kind of clarity, yeah, in the picture, yeah.
Another thing that this question brought to my mind was as I was researching the people into this treasure hunting business, I met a man who's kind of like the master of knowledge, and everyone comes to him and asks about places, maps, you know, the authenticity of the objects, whatever. And well, as far as I could understand, that there is a population from Greece and Greek people, population of Greek people who don't come here themselves, but kind of find these men to appropriate and find their buried wealth. So it's not that real people come here going to engage with their land and with their history, but it's on a more I think that this happens on a more professional level, that these people hire some people with some maps and they try to find their buried treasure via through Turkish people still or Kurdish people still, so that there is like this another layer of not going to homeland, not going to your past and history and memory, but just trying to access your wealth that was left there in Turkey in some time, and then if you could still acquire it. So there is that kind of a level to it as well. And when you were speaking, I have one more question. When you were speaking about the Kurdish population that's into this treasure looting business, it's also interesting that while I was researching, I found a lot of people digging for treasury and finding bones of people who were murdered in the 1990s, the civil war. And I don't know if you kind of cross-read this with still a lot of the unresolved murders of the 90s and the Kurdish people's involvement with this, and they encounter while they're researching a treasure of the Armenian past. It's like there is like this double reading to it. Do you agree with me?
It's not something that I've really come across very much. I mean, people have not made references to. I mean, no. I mean, of course, death appears in many different forms, and also in its kind of buried version. And if you go around the countryside and people say, oh yeah, on top of that hill, I know there's 3 guerrillas buried there, but it's not marked. So of course there's other histories of violence that and other forms of burials and hiding and making invisible that are there. But I have not come across stories where these dimensions are directly linked, or these kind of histories become entangled in the process of discovery. But it's just a lot of these things are just sometimes it's subject to the kind of coincidences of fieldwork, because my friend, one of my colleagues, Özlem, she works in Mardin, and so she's also kind of the issue of treasures and treasure hunting appeared in her work, and for her what is very present are these jinns, these kind of ghostly little, I don't know, genies, who guard the treasures. So she worked a lot on that, and I was always like, it's so funny that people never kind of mention genes in Mush, maybe they're just, and until you ask, okay, are there any genes here? It's like, of course there are genes here. Like, wait, I've come in for 3-4 years, nobody's ever told me about genes, So you never, this is what I mean, you never know what, so it's just like, you weren't there in the right moment when these stories are shared, or, But I mean, people always come across bones. But I mean, of course, there's bones everywhere. But I have not heard saying, oh yeah, no, I know this is from the 90s,
Or maybe like the Armenians. You never know. It's still the object and its authenticity and its origin, and it's still the same thing. It's like a bone treated as an object, as you were talking about.
But I think in relation to the 90s, the knowledge is much more present and much more proximate, So you wouldn't just say, oh, it's just a bone, but you would. I mean, people know, this is not long ago. I mean, people know that. So this is, Anybody has any other questions?
Thank you.
Or comments? But we've also sat here for an hour now.
One other question. For example, when you look with people, with the treasure hunters, the pictures like that, or like, there was this one, maybe it was in the other room, this one guy had a dead child, and then, when I look at it, one of the children is lying down. One of the children is lying down, and they're stories that are really, really humane, that tell us really obviously sad stories. when you talk to treasure hunters about this, like when you're looking at the actual picture, what happens?
Yeah, no,
You don't do that.
no, not that I don't do it, but I haven't come across these kind of people lying down. No, I have not. I mean, mostly they're crosses, or they're more abstract symbols, or swirls, or a snake, or a kind of the bear, or these other kind of. I haven't come across. I mean, people haven't shared these like more. Symbols that point to a more concrete event or scene in that way.
Well, another thing, like because I collected them from the forums, it's also weird to me that a man would post a picture like this and ask what it means and how he would go to the treasure, with this, how might it become a symbol. And I was like fascinated by the answers people are posting, and it's like that's kind of another work. And I was thinking whether to include that information I possess to the work or not, and I decided to leave it out and leave this space like this. But I am thinking of dealing with this information because, when you post a picture and then you ask a question, and a lot of people make up like all these, knowledge, and they think it's narrative and it's right narrative, and so it's also interesting to view that on these internet forums.
Anyone mentioning?
It's so funny. This is like the language that's like street language, hey bro, stuff like that. But it's like there's a lot of swearing that's going on. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. So it's a lot of you don't see knowledge, but you see a lot of power tripping on the other. So it's not about the sign at all. They're just they start power tripping after a point. But there were really interesting things because like one of the posts was like a man was posting a cross sign and then asking what a cross sign is, and then the people were so varied. Like some of them didn't know the cross, some of them said, oh, you don't know cross sign, like this kind of an inner conversation starts building up in those forums. But I think I'm gonna do some other stuff with what I found there soon. Yeah. Thank you for the people who are still here with us. And do you want to say anything else? And yeah, thanks a lot for coming and joining us.